Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. And today I have my friend, colleague, Behnam Ben Taleblu. He is a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam is going to be a co-host for Generation Jihad going forward, one day a week. Behnam, welcome to Generation Jihad. I'll have to not say that going forward in the future. Great to have you on and looking forward to us co-hosting the show together.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to more aggressively embracing this role. Thank you so much.
Well, you're perfect for it, Behnam. You're going to be the well-spoken part of this podcast, that's for sure. Certainly a lot to discuss in the war. We're going to tackle a couple of issues today. We have the administration's what looks to be wavering support for Israel, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State's trip to Israel, leaked intelligence that the Israelis are half of their bombs that are being dropped in Gaza are not precision-guided missiles, precision-guided munition. Houthi attacks that are just really spiraling out of control in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And then we're going to take a wider look at the Iran's diplomatic strategy. But let's turn back to the first item. I believe it was yesterday, President Biden said that Israel is losing global support for its operation against Hamas and due to, and this is put these two words in quote, indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. And then you pair that with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I believe he landed this morning. We're recording around 12:30 on Friday, December 15th here. So he is there to pressure Israel to wind down the war and get back to targeted raids against Hamas, targeted operations, basically wind the clock back and yet, just go for terrorist leaders and terrorist fighters. And the administration, does it look like a staunch supporter of Israel today, or does it look like an administration that's trying to play both sides of this war?
It's quite clear the administration, in my view, is serious in trying to allow Israel to find both the political time and the military space to achieve its stated goal about trying to destroy Hamas. I take the administration commentary about giving Israel that space, particularly after the grotesque attacks of October 7th. But the problem is, in the world beyond October 7th, not just the domestic politics here, not just the social and kind of technological, technology-enabled changes you're seeing in the debate over what it means to be pro-Israel within the kind of classic mainstream left-right divide of America. All that notwithstanding is the optics and the politics of the war, and the U.S. really lack of a diplomatic strategy in the Middle East has caught it flat-footed to the fact that the countries that have older peace agreements with Israel and a land border, like Egypt and Jordan, are playing a fundamentally different role than the countries that have newer peace agreements and no land border, like a Morocco, UAE, Bahrain. So they're open to the different diplomatic critiques coming from different Arab governments. But all of this notwithstanding, there was certainly tension with the Netanyahu government prior to October 7, which I think is bleeding over now. It's impossible to divorce politics in Israel from essentially everything, and it's impossible to divorce that from the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. You're seeing commentary from a few weeks ago about Blinken talking about Israel not reportedly having credit or something else on the books for what it's been looking to do vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza. And now you're hearing all these fits and starts about timelines when a conflict is supposed to be over politically versus when a conflict is supposed to be over militarily. One would have thought that after 2 decades of U.S. experience in the Middle East, where the military battlefield was circumscribed by the political timeline and political clock, we would know better than to put this same failed formula in front of an ally that the administration so wholeheartedly purports to support. But when you add all of these ingredients up, it becomes a very, very, very messy cocktail of, yeah, perhaps from a policy perspective, I still do take the administration seriously when they say they stand with Israel. But in terms of the day-to-day grind of that policy, they are doing and saying things that cast a lot of doubt into their ability to be a good partner. And at the 500,000 foot level, the reason I see a disconnect there is because they have a fundamentally, they being the Biden administration, have a fundamentally different policy towards Hamas than they do towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, the most important patron of Hamas. And so whatever you believe about my view of the politics or my view of the policies before what I just said, so long as you have that contradiction in your regional policy, it is not going to be an effective way to stand with Israel in the medium to long term.
Yeah, it just comes off as unserious. I do agree with you. I think the administration wants to stand with Israel. It just does. It by its words, really don't give off the impression that it's fully standing. I mean, look, could we imagine if one of our staunchest allies, let's say Great Britain, 2 months after 9/11, started to chide the United States, saying we were conducting indiscriminate bombings in Afghanistan, and then we need to dial back, we need to wind down the ground operations, and just started going after targeted raids against Al Qaeda and Taliban leaders. Like, how mad would we be here in the United States if that type of message, if that type of front was presented by our greatest ally? The administration really
better.
does.
Just a footnote. I'll do you one better. I remember a few months after the Iraq, I remember people pouring Bordeaux into the sewers in New York, and I remember freedom fries. Not that it was wise. In fact, now I think a lot of us see how foolhardy the Iraq connection was. But nonetheless, you also had in the same political spirit, major allies casting doubt. And some of us would say, yeah, rightly, but look how politically we weaponized that doubt that was cast by an ally, whether for good or for ill. And I remember the Bordeaux in the drain. I remember the Gigonda in the drain. And I'm sure we all remember the Freedom Fries.
Freedom Fries was one of the most bizarre and laughable things of the early 2000s. Yeah, and I intentionally left Iraq off the table here because that was a war of choice in the sense.
Exactly.
Even though it wasn't presented as such, it really was. And it was very clear to me at the time that it was. We're talking, October 7th was Israel's 9/11. Let's face it. If that attack occurred on the scale here in the United States, I think the numbers are somewhere around 20-something thousand Americans would have been killed. That's how devastating, how impactful that Hamas's attack was. So I think the last thing we would want to have heard from one of our closest allies after invading Afghanistan was that we need to dial it back a little bit. That's just the administration just seems to be caving to international pressure from allies in the Middle East, domestic pressure from the pro-Palestinian faction, which I think it overrates within the Democratic Party, but that's neither here nor there. We're certainly not going to get into the politics of all this, but I think the administration's making some of these statements in an attempt to placate different, internal and external groups. The reality is it's placating no one by making these statements. The pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas faction, be it domestic or international, are going to still accuse the administration of supporting genocidal Zionists. And, the Arab countries or Muslim countries that are unhappy with U.S. support of Israel are going to continue to not be happy. So, and then it's pissing off Israel at the same time. So I just find these types of strategies, if you can even call it that, to be short-sighted and really not having the desired effect that I think this administration would like to achieve.
There's a good parallel with the stepping up, but still more limited U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria, particularly since October 17th, when the first major batch of militia attacks on our presence in Iraq and Syria took place, which is the nature of the commentary we put out. And you and I have discussed this before with Joe at length. The nature of our political commentary circumscribes the military effect of our military moves. The human mind doesn't create these artificial divides that we try to project onto foreign policy or to politics. Signaling is both word and deed. And in a world where I said we don't really have a diplomatic strategy for the Middle East, our talk, however cheap it may seem to some politicians, is that diplomatic strategy, or takes the role or fills the role of that strategy. And when you say one thing to placate one domestic audience and you do one thing to placate another foreign audience, both sides, like you said, will be dissatisfied. And then it's the administration who will lose.
Now, Behnam, that's well said. You definitely clarified some thoughts that I had there about how this works. You are absolutely correct. But absent a diplomatic strategy, the words are going to be taken as strategy, particularly outside of the United States. And what they're hearing is all over the place. Let's turn to, amazingly, U.S. intelligence a couple of days ago, it was leaked out that they estimate that somewhere around 45% of the munitions fired by Israeli aircraft were not precision guided. And this is being taken as evidence, of course, by the anti-Israel factions to mean that the Israelis are looking to commit genocide and destroy all of Gaza and things of that nature. Now, I'm going to say this. Let's say we take the Gazan Health Ministry's estimates of, I think there's somewhere over 18,000 casualties at face value, which I don't. It's run by Hamas. Of those 18,000 killed, of course, 145% of them were civilians, and 300% of those were, of course, women and children. So that's how the Gaza Health Ministry runs. But let's just take that number at face value. The Israelis are very inefficiently conducting genocide based on those numbers. So that's absurd in itself. What people don't understand about these type of conflicts is that, and I've had experience with embedding with U.S. forces in Iraq particularly, is that your stockpiles of precision-guided munitions are quickly depleted. While the U.S. was conducting counterinsurgency operations in 2007 in Iraq, I watched military units use non-precision guided munitions. I watched helicopters use missiles that weren't guided. I watched artillery units fire regular artillery, and mortar units launch non-guided mortars at targets. This is war, and you go to war with what you have, as I believe that's what former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, and he was castigated for this, but he was right. I mean, you use what you have in your arsenal. The Israelis, look, the last number I heard is that they dropped I think it was over 29,000 munitions in Gaza alone. They also have to prepare for a potential war on the border with Hezbollah as well, where they would need precision guided munitions because of the thousands upon thousands of rockets, missiles, and other weapon system pointed at Israel from there. So, I find reporting like this to be breathless, to be completely lacking the understanding of war, as if any military in any country, Western country, the stockpiles are completely filled with guided munitions. Behnam, I know you know a lot about guided munitions. What are your thoughts on these reports, and what the Israelis, do they have to conserve some of the stockpile to deal with the potential Hezbollah threat as well?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. Maybe just, first thing off the bat, you said I know a lot about the guided munitions. Unfortunately, I know a hell of a lot more about the guided versus unguided aerial threats and capabilities of our adversaries than I do of us and our allies. That's just the side of the street I focus on.
Yeah, sure. But, and real quick, Behnam, but you do understand, I know you know this, right? They have unguided as well. No group, no army.
Oh, absolutely.
Completely has full capacity. Your knowledge of our enemies' capabilities certainly can translate to what our allies' capabilities are as well. Just want to, give you a little boost there.
Thank you. No, I was just trying to clear the air here. I was not going to say this is, one use of where you need a small diameter bomb versus a JDAM versus something else. I'm familiar with what exists here in the U.S. arsenal. I'm familiar with some things in the Israeli arsenal. I was just trying to tell the audience I'm much more intimately familiar with the slightest gyrations of what is reported in our adversary's arsenal than me keeping up every single day with the Israeli Defense Industrial Base or the American Defense Industrial Base. But I am a student of history, and I am a student of war, and exactly what you mentioned about the reporting being a little bit breathless. This is exactly a Kodak moment. This is a Polaroid moment. This is not a video or a story in progress moment. These sorts of reports do happen. They are in fact designed to decontextualize. They're not useful, I think. Even if one harbors an anti-Israel disposition, they're not useful because you don't learn enough about what's left in the arsenal. A country buys weapons or produces armaments or procures these capabilities in relation to its threats. I'm very glad you mentioned the northern threat from Hezbollah right now. Every single day in Israel, there is a new normal being established on the northern front. The presence of the U.S. carrier, plus the forces that Israel has up the north, plus the fact that Israel has about 100,000 to 200,000 internally displaced persons, plus the fact that, of course, they are trying to respond without provoking to the Hezbollah attacks, which include IRAMs, which include rockets, which include mortars, which include drones, which include rockets, without begetting that PGM volley that the IDF and the IEF are most concerned about, is part of why you may have to conserve some of these systems. But the fact that PGMs are being used to begin with, or were used in the frontal part of the aerial campaign in Gaza, or the hold part of the clear and hold element of the strategy when they moved into northern Gaza first, is a sign that this is a different kind of warfighting capability that the Israelis have. This is actually the polar opposite, I would say, of indiscriminate, when you are trying to first clear territory, hold territory, doing combined arms operations, and then also ultimately doing the tough work of the tunnel investigations, which is leading to lots of deaths. By the way, there's tons of stories coming out about these booby trap tunnels, clearing and finding weapons caches in schools and mosques and hospitals and homes. Most unfortunately, this stuff is messy. And there is a saying in Persian, which it loosely translates to, they don't pass out sweets in war. And why I'm glad you mentioned that this reporting was breathless is it fundamentally misunderstands war. It's not to say that every move should not be taken to prevent civilian casualties. I simply think that when you have an adversary like Hamas doing everything it does with human shields, and a terrain like Gaza with its density consistently being compressed deeper and deeper and deeper, and weapons in these kind of civilian centers, and fighters hiding among the civilian population, and an entire code of conduct that is entirely antithetical to the Geneva Convention. Hamas quite literally is a terror organization supported by the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism, and both of them harbor genocidal intentions towards the only Jewish state in the world. Things are going to look slightly different. But even when all of this is taken into account, there is no conflict in the world in which, most unfortunately, civilians don't die. This is not a justification. This is an understanding that even one death is too much. And that's why, in general, war often is pushed, even by states like Israel, to the last possible option. And even by states like Israel that know the intent of Hamas, that had Hamas living on its doorstep, really, after they withdrew 2005-06. These operations could have been commenced with less precise weapons more than a decade earlier. They weren't because of an understanding, particularly in democratic societies, of the cost of war, the human cost of war. That's why, for example, we take a corollary. The Israelis or the Americans have not directly attacked the Iranian nuclear program, despite knowing full well what capability this, what strategy these capabilities are designed to underwrite. War is brutally messy, and that kind of one-off reporting that decontextualizes the data, that disconnects the dots between the other threats that other armaments and other capabilities are supposed to be attributed towards, is designed to decontextualize and disconnect the dots between the nature of war and the nature of the war fighter. So this gets very philosophical for me, because as someone who doesn't want a single civilian death, and who genuinely is upset by all the civilian deaths that you've seen pre, post, during October 7 and into the present, this is why Hamas must not be permitted to win.
Yeah, I love that Persian saying. It's don't pass out candy in war. That is just perfect.
Or they don't pass out candy in war. That would meaning to say that the things that happen in
Yeah,
war
are
are
all ugly.
so brutal. Or the Clausewitz line: the ultimate purpose of war is to serve itself. Some may take that here and try to decontextualize and say, oh, we're justifying these things, but this really is the case of no, we're trying to explain. We have had the privilege in the West, particularly in America, to forget about the nature of war. It is a privilege alien to human history to have to forget about the brutality of war.
You are speaking my language, Behnam. I got to tell you, in numerous private conversations, I've been beating this drum. I mean, look, wars are horrible by nature. They should be avoided at all costs. And once they're begun, they should be prosecuted to the bloody end. And because, extending the wars, you want to ensure more civilian casualties in Gaza, try and fight this war with one hand held behind your back and watch this war drag out and watch more infrastructure be destroyed and more civilians being killed. Israel didn't ask for this war. It wasn't invaded it didn't invade Gaza on October 7th. The opposite happened to a level of barbarity that we haven't seen maybe since the genocide in Rwanda. I don't know. There's something in between. But yeah, no, Behnam, you are speaking my language here. We should probably save that for another discussion. But yeah, I could not agree with you more.
Can I add 2 footnotes?
Absolutely,
Keep the conversation, but it is hot, and I know myself I will absolutely forget, even though you said we should put a bit in.
No, listen, it's our podcast. We could talk about whatever the hell we want.
Okay, so forgive me, but there's a corollary here, and you can totally take Israel out of the equation. It is about the politics of war, the optics of war, the luxury of having to not know what war looks like. And sometimes the promise and sometimes the peril of being a U.S. partner in the Middle East. And right now, I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen, also a war that the Saudis didn't want. Fundamentally, you look at the history of the Houthis and the Saudis. You go back to the Cold War era. It was totally topsy turvy. It wasn't even the animosity that we see today. But the reason I'm saying this, by the Houthi takeover of Yemen and the threat that would begin to pose with the Saudis, the flirtation and the partnership that people denied in 2014, 15, and 16 between the Houthis and Iran, between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia's major geostrategic, political, economic, military, and ideational competitor of the region. All of that was ignored, or all of that was wiped under the rug. And when the Saudis responded, and particularly responded in a world where the Obama administration had a different view towards Iran, and we would say, okay, Middle Eastern solutions to Middle Eastern problems, and the Saudis led the messy coalition in the way that they could and with the weapons that they did. And once the West, particularly America, did not like the optics of that war, despite pushing away from the table on the concerns and threats that were leading up to that war day to day in the Middle East, one of the first things that was supposed to be cut was ISR, and in general intelligence sharing and targeting equipment and aerial refueling. Well, all that stuff does make a U.S. partner in the Middle East fight wars with one arm tied behind their back. And the non-sale of precision weaponry, well, what does that mean that that your partner is left with to fight someone that they believe they have to fight against? It will lead to more and more and more both political distrust between the U.S. and its partners in the region and more civilian casualties, actually. So the way we fight these wars, not with our adversaries, but with our partners and our allies, the way we fight the politics over these wars matters as much and impacts directly what our allies have to offer against their adversaries.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that.
This in slow motion with the Saudis and the Houthis, and it seems like that entire element is forgotten here.
It's an excellent point. You're right. And let's leave Israel out of this discussion, right? What about how we treated our Afghan partners? That doesn't look so good. How about how we've been treating our Ukrainian partners, right? As the offensive is failing, Afghanistan needs no explanation, right? We abandon them, we leave them in the lurch. the Ukrainian issue now, right? As the offensive is not going well, then the recriminations begin. But it's all done in leaks and behind the scenes and when articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post. If you're an ally of the United States, you got to be looking and going, boy, when do I get my knife in the back? Our foreign policy has not been serious for, I mean, I'll say the last decade, but I'm sure it extends well beyond that. But we have not only sent the wrong messages to our enemies, and we're going to get with that with the Houthis very shortly, but to our allies. Our allies are getting all the wrong messages. And now I'm seeing images of President Vladimir Putin from Russia being fitted as he lands in Saudi Arabia and meanwhile, our Secretary of State is left on the tarmac overnight, and not just in Saudi Arabia, and left on the tarmac for several hours in Turkey. I mean, these are, those aren't accidents that these things happen. This is the perception. These are the problems that we've created, and the perceptions out there now in full view amongst our allies that we are becoming, as each day goes on, we become less and less a serious partner.
There's nothing to drive home that image about waiting on the tarmac than the previous trip Putin took to the UAE, where you have, I believe it was, American jets painting the Russian flag in the sky. Admittedly, the flag is still red, white, and blue. You could pretend it's the French flag if you don't want to pretend it's the American or Russian flag, but welcoming the Russian president like that. I mean, obviously there's politics there, but this should remind us that why we need a diplomatic strategy towards the Middle East. This is not a soft man's, kowtow, cop-out answer. This is, we need to know that we have to hold our friends' hands and then sometimes press those hands firmly, sometimes pull them in, sometimes whisper something in the ear, sometimes give them a tough but tender embrace. We can't just talk down to our friends and partners in the region, especially when our friends and partners in the region keep reminding us that they have options. This is just worth noting.
Yeah, look, Clausewitz is right. I mean, war is an extension of politics, and we don't have a political diplomatic strategy in the military East, and therefore we're acting reactionary. There's not even between administrations a coherent policy, right? Look at the Iran and the JCPOA, and I mean, we can go on and on, Behnam, about this, and maybe we will focus a podcast on just this, but I think you really touched on it today, that our lack of strategy, our lack of diplomatic strategy leads to, and let's get into this, our inability to respond to Houthi attacks on international shipping, not just on U.S. warships or Israeli warships or Israeli cargo, but international freighters are being targeted. Look, the last time I checked, and this number may have changed between now and very likely for you, the listener, between when we record at this moment and you get a chance to listen, there's been 3 attacks on international shipping in the last 24 hours. The Houthis are on a near daily basis attacking either. There was a French warship that was targeted with 2 drones. U.S. warships have been targeted multiple times, despite the Department of Defense trying to say, well, we're not sure if we were actually targeted in that attack, even though the drones were flying directly at U.S. warships. Tankers have been hit with missiles. They've been boarded by Houthi fighters. And our reaction has been, from the United States, has been nothing. Now, look, I would argue this is an international problem, not just a U.S. problem, not just an Israel problem, because not just U.S. ships are getting targeted in this. And, look, one of the oldest reasons that militaries were formed was to put down acts of piracy and banditry. And yet we can't seem to figure out a way to respond to this other than issue mealy-mouthed warnings like, we're considering what to do to, like, this literally came out, I don't know if it was the Defense Department or the State Department, it doesn't matter. I think the last thing I read from them is like, we're considering our options. Yeah, well, that'll get the Houthis to stop the attacks, because they've been doing this since almost a month now. It's been 4 weeks now. And nothing we've said is going to make them stop. The only thing that's going to make them stop is a harsh response. I don't. And what are your thoughts, Behnam?
They have to know such a response is coming, but if I can just back away from the Houthi aerial versus maritime threat for a second, sometimes things in life are brought to you by, ironically, success. And this is why, again, I want to stress the U.S. needs a overall strategy for the Middle East, not just to offset for when we fumble or when our allies and partners fumble and how to stop our opponents and their opponents from taking advantage of it, but also how to respond to when our adversaries enact plans based off of the success of our plans. You know, I remember during the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, a lot of the GOP folks, a lot of the Trump folks, a lot of the Republicans were enthralled with the economic success. And rightly they should, because within about a year and a half's time, macroeconomically, they recreated the pressure that multilaterally took over a decade to create and inflict. This is an immensely powerful tool of coercion and deterrence and punishment that did not require a single shot to fire. But the problem is, given how successful this is, the adversary intends to respond, and that's where the previous administration had significant room for improvement. And the reason I'm saying that here is because the Israelis, with reportedly having to use the F-35, with reportedly the PAC-3, with reportedly Arrow 2, and probably some other capabilities, have been intercepting Houthi suicide drones, Houthi land attack cruise missiles, Houthi medium-range ballistic missiles. We know, of course, of Aegis-enabled destroyers in the Red Sea. Also, U.S. vessels helping to track and detect and destroy these longer-range strike capabilities. So in the world where the architecture of deterrence by denial, whether U.S. or Israeli, prevented the Houthis from being able to act on what Long War Journal was the first organization to call the Houthis' willingness back in 2017 to enter a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in the inability of the Houthis, due to the success of this architecture of deterrence by denial, to strike at Israel proper on land, they shifted. So in the face of the success of our deterrence by denial strategy, they are targeting now the whole fleet of maritime vessels that they allege are Israeli owned or controlled or are trafficking areas that they believe should fall under their purview, or ultimately that they believe will be docking in Eilat in southern Israel. And they're using, again, anti-ship cruise missiles provided by Iran, anti-ship ballistic missiles provided by Iran, suicide drones provided by Iran, to harass and target these vessels. Recently, I think about 2 days ago, based on when this podcast is being recorded and when it will come out, you had almost an attempt to land a blow, I think using a suicide drone, against a vessel carrying fuel. Imagine not just the environmental and political, but the strategic implications of a fireball in the Red Sea, and what that would do to insurance premiums on all other commercial vessels going there. So the success of the Israelis and our deterrence by denial strategy got the Houthis to shift to lower hanging fruit. And it's clear that in the absence of absence of a political strategy to understand what is the threshold to absorb, what is the threshold to warn, what is the threshold to respond in kind, and what is the threshold to escalate, in the absence of unanswered questions by both us and the Israelis about how to respond to the Houthi threat, we're unfortunately going to see many more of these attacks. We are continuing to see more of these attacks. I think it is good news that the administration now wants to extend the logic of all those other task forces. They have task forces for the Strait of Hormuz, for the Persian Gulf, for the Arabian Sea, for the Indian Ocean, for the Gulf of Aden, and they should extend them for the Red Sea. There already is, a couple of different multinational security international constructs there for arms trafficking and detection, interception operations, older stuff that went from Iran to Yemen. If some of that stuff was as 100% successful, then the Houthis may not have had some of these more advanced anti-ship capabilities today. But I digress. If the administration is intent on broadening this coalition, I think that is great news. Already there was a story that you flagged for me about less than a week ago, Bill, of a French interception of an Iranian suicide drone. Even the French here are involved and engaging in deterrence by denial. The question is, which one of this international coalition, which member of this, if we do what Jake Sullivan does and extend it, is going to engage in that next step, which is to establish those thresholds and engage in deterrence by punishment. Many people forget we have the USS Mason in the region. The USS Mason is not alien to this region. It is not even alien to the Houthi threat. In 2016, you remember, and Longword Journal documented the use of anti-ship cruise missiles. Iranian-provided Chinese copies, I believe C-801s or C-802s, anti-ship cruise missiles being fired towards the Mason. The U.S. did militarily respond. And for a period of time, that military response brought the lull and then the drop in direct attacks by the Houthis using Iranian-provided anti-ship capabilities against their naval assets. So again, there is a clear predicate. There is a historical predicate. There is just a question of our politics again. And this is where, let me bring in another complicating factor if this wasn't messy enough. There was a story a few days ago, and I want our audience to know this because, again, there are costs to not standing by your partner. Just like in the world of the U.S. not, taking the GCC position, particularly the Saudi position prior to the 2015 nuclear deal on how outsized the Iran regional threat is and how afraid these countries were of the Iran regional threat, and then not being informed of this secret kind of multilateral track for diplomacy with the Iranians, and then again, the politics of the JCPOA in 2015. Once they saw all of this, some of them, like the UAE, hedged. Others thought, just like the Saudis, that you have to take things into your own hands, and you got the war in Yemen. Well, the war in Yemen, what's the current status of that today? There have been multiple ceasefires extended, despite the Houthis showcasing that during these periods of ceasefires, they have had revolutions in long-range strike capabilities. Again, the Houthis now are the only proxy of Iran to use anti-ship ballistic missiles. They're the only proxy of Iran to even possess, let alone use, medium-range ballistic missiles. These are game-changing military capabilities. And in this period of time, the Saudis have adopted a fundamentally different approach. They see the U.S., because of the politics, because of the optics that we mentioned, distancing itself both from the region as well as from the support for that campaign against the Houthis, as well as from any kind of clear political strategy as to what the future of Yemen should look like. And the Saudis now, based on this report from about a week ago, have been warning the Americans, oh, please God, don't militarily respond because then the Houthis will go at us. The story is not clearly confirmed, but it is based on a couple of unnamed regional diplomatic sources. This is where I worry because in the absence of the lack of leadership and the clear and hard-nosed assessment of threats in the region, our allies are going to be vacillating, overcompensating and undercompensating just so that they can live another day. And in this world now, we have a force, Saudi Arabia, that maybe 8 years ago was besieging us for help. And now they're going to be calling on us, allegedly, for restraint. And it all comes back down to, well, how were you tough with the Houthis to begin with? Did you connect the dots between the Houthis and Iran to begin with? And that original failure continues to beget more and more and more policy problems for us.
Yeah. And, look, why is President Putin so welcome in his trip to Saudi Arabia, right?
He's consistent.
Maybe the Saudis are finally saying it's time to look. There's a couple of quick things, and then we're gonna talk about Iran's diplomatic strategy. You had mentioned the insurance, right? And that was just something we had very early on. You, me, and Joe discussed was the insurance rates. This is from 11 days ago. I'm going to directly read this quote from Reuters. Insurance industry sources said that war risk premiums had stayed firm on Monday between 0.05% to 0.1% of the value of ship from around 0.03 estimated last week before the attack. So the 11 days ago, insurance rates doubled to tripled for ships traveling near Yemen. What do you think it is today after ships have been boarded, struck, U.S. warships have been attacked, French warships have been attacked? I think those rates have doubled and tripled again. And I want to be very clear. This shouldn't be just a U.S. response to the Houthis. This should be an international response. It's just not U.S. and warships, again, U.S. tankers the international community, the Chinese, the Russians, they're either buying oil or sending goods through these routes. Everyone has an interest in not allowing, which is essentially a sophisticated form of piracy being conducted by the Houthis. So, but we talked a lot about our lack of diplomatic and strategy. Behnam, let's talk about Iran's diplomatic strategy. We talked a lot previously about its military strategy with supporting the Houthis. Let's talk wider about its diplomatic strategy in the region. What does it seek from Israel's conflict with Gaza, with the standoff between Hezbollah and Israel in the north and beyond?
In general, I had mentioned the success of some of our policies sometimes, or the success of any policy, will cause an adversary or an opponent of that policy to recalibrate. And in this case, where there was a real potential to develop a new least common denominator for Middle East security, and the potential really to create, inshallah, a nonpartisan or a bipartisan and sustainable approach to the Middle East, and that was with the Abraham Accords and the continuous extension of that success spooked the Iranians. And in that sense, the Iranian support for the Hamas operation cannot be divorced from the success of the normalization agreements. And you literally had the last speech Khamenei was giving on October 3rd, before the October 7th operation, where remember the last couple paragraphs of his speech were devoted to admonishing and punishing and trying to change the view of Arab governments who had already and were harboring intent to further normalize with the Israelis. He literally said it's like betting on a losing horse. So ultimately here, this diplomatic success that the U.S. had, when you don't shepherd a success, when you don't take from the sapling and care for it and defend it and let it wither on the vines for a few years and ultimately rediscover it circa election time, as I think the administration did with the Saudi initiative, despite not even wanting to use the word Abraham Accords for the first 2 years, most of the Biden folks who were in office. This is exactly what happens. You get the adversary believing that you're fundamentally unserious and them testing you and checking you in real world terms. And in the real world, that is with blood. And that's what makes the costs of another mistake in the Middle East very, very scary. This is what I mean when I say Iran has a diplomatic strategy. It is able to read this. It is able to wait. It is able to calculate and recalibrate based on not just our defeats or shortcomings, where that creates opportunities like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, as you've discussed and written at length for over a decade, but also of our successes, however limited, and the threat perception they have of any success or any win for the Middle Eastern order. And that's precisely why with the Arab states, they've been trying to do this. You could call it salami tactics. You could call it what the Italians call it, the politica del carciofo, the politics of the artichoke, deal with your enemies one at a time, rope-a-doping different elements of the GCC, different relationship with Qatar, different relationship with Oman, different relationship with the UAE, and even after March and May, a fundamentally different diplomatic relationship with the Saudis. Again, all of this does not mean that there is depth, but it does mean that there is a new breath. They have a new ground game. Iran has a diplomatic ground game in the Middle East. And even unlike the Israeli ground game in Gaza, where it is centered on results, the result is the ultimate driver. The result is trying to eradicate Hamas, get rid of the terror tunnels, get rid of the weapons, get rid of the political infrastructure, get rid of the ability to launch future attacks, to not make Gaza a springboard for future attacks on Israel. That is a results-based approach. The Iranians right now have an ideological view of the results, but they have a, unfortunately and worth noting, realistic view of the process to effectuate those results. And we're in the Middle East right now watching these two different paradigms, the results-based one and the process-based one. And the Iranians have significantly less capability. But I think right now, because they're focusing on process and owning the space diplomatically for that process, that the cost of us not having the process, even the Israelis not having the process, matters a great deal. So this is just this divide between process and results I would like to put in the minds and ears and eyes of LWJ listeners.
Yeah, Behnam, that is well said. I mean, what they lack in capabilities, they certainly make up for in organization and vision and boldness as well. For such a small country compared to the United States, compared to Europe, it certainly punches well above its weight. The Iranians are bold, they're well organized, and they have a vision, a political goal that they seek to achieve throughout the Middle East. Behnam, thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to getting you on every week, co-hosting the show with me. We got a lot of great things to talk about.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, and looking forward to it. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Thanks again. We'll see you all again soon.